Tolmay was one of the speakers at the IEC's dialogue on the role of women in leadership in the last 30 years that took place at Gauteng's East Rand. She joins me now via Teams. Ms. Tolmay, thank you very much indeed for your time. I really do appreciate it. Talk to me first about this decline of women representation in the National Assembly, in particular in this administration.
So, good morning, and thank you for inviting me. What we've seen over the last 30 years since democracy is quite a good increase. In 1994, we had 28% of women in the lower house of parliament. That's what I'm talking about at the moment. Yeah. That went up to 30, it went up to 40, it got to 46 in the last administration, and now it's gone back down to 43. So we're seeing an up and down. Nothing stays the same, and there's always an opportunity for there to be such increases and decreases where political parties don't commit to 50% of women in their structures.
And this certainly erodes what the conversation has been about, was that having that, equal representation or more representation of women in these particular positions. What we've seen over the past couple of years, as you've indicated, is, can we say, an erosion of that? Why is it not being taken seriously?
I mean, you can say that there's been an erosion. The thing, and South Africa is not, it's not an outlier. In many African countries, we see a little bit of that up and down movement. In South Africa in particular, it's very much got to do with the fact that some political parties have quotas. So, for example, the ANC and the EFF have 50% quotas. They use a zebra list, and they actually comply with this. So they have 50% or more. The problem with voluntary party quotas is when the party loses seats, as was the case in the recent elections with the ANC losing a number of seats, you have parties that don't have quotas, such as the DA, the MK, or any of the other parties that won substantially more seats. You'll see that number go down. And that's why we are seeing that decrease, because we don't have a commitment across all of the parties. We know, for example, the countries with the highest numbers of women in the SADC region, Namibia, Mozambique, and South Africa, all of the ruling parties have voluntary party quotas, which they comply with. The other countries where there are no voluntary party quotas, we see the lowest levels of representation. So it's got to do with the system in which the electoral system and how representatives are elected and whether there are special measures.
I mean, what ways can we ensure, meaningful participation of women and other vulnerable sectors across programs of parliament then? The Women's Parliament, oversight programs, budget processes, taking Parliament to the people, for example, provincial weeks, but just to name a few, if we have this eroding representation of women in these key areas?
Well, it's also about optics. It sends a message to the public, to young women, for example, that women aren't competent. If we don't see women there, it's a basic fact. It's democracy. We should be there in equal numbers, regardless of what women do. Men have always been there in numbers, regardless of how they've performed. So, we really are looking, though, towards moving beyond the numbers. So we do find the numbers important because we know that the more women they are, the more likely they are to support each other. Not always the case, but it is often the case, especially with multi-party caucuses that come together around women's issues. But I think the biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems, is the kinds of issues that are covered during elections and, throughout the year. Every Women's Month, we hear all about women's issues, but what's happening for the other 11 months of the year? That's where we need to see more women coming to the fore in promoting progressive policies. But we also need to start, I would say, at the school level to get young women involved in politics, because there's a dearth of young women, and it's a very hostile space. So the space needs to change in order to bring new blood, especially young women, to Parliament.
Yeah. With that gap or that void, how do we ensure that the voices of women and other vulnerable groups are heard, not only in identifying with who participates in these programs, but that women can basically actively shape and influence how these programs are put together, the content of these programs, to ensure that the needs and desires of women and other vulnerable groups take centre stage in the work of Parliament, if it is indeed to be a people-centric approach?
Yes, I mean, obviously any Parliament should be consulting with constituencies. The problem with our electoral system it's recently changed. We haven't changed from the proportional representation model. This last elections allowed independent parties to stand, but none of them won seats and only 6 parties made it through. Now, when you're voting for a person or a constituency, you can hold that elected official accountable. When there's no constituency system, there's no one that you can actually go to and say, what are you doing? How can we be involved? So it's all about the political system and about how involved the politicians are within their constituencies and whether they care about that, because they don't have actual constituencies. So at the local government level, I think we've got a lot more opportunity there. We do see quite a discrepancy between the PR councillors and the ward councillors. So and it's more difficult for women to be elected in constituencies seats because of the skepticism that people have around women's representation. But if we can start to increase women there, that really is the level of government where you get the community engagement, where you get ideas around the kinds of things that you should be doing as a politician in order to address the challenges that women face. As I say, the local government is a more conducive space for that, because local councillors are far more connected to their communities than parliamentarians are. So we've also seen decreases in women's representation at the lower government level from 40% in the previous elections to 37%. So we need to see whether we're going to see another decrease or whether we are going to find ways of progressing. And I think a lot of that has to do with, leadership, how we develop our leaders from, quite a young age, and how we start to mentor them to get into these spaces that have generally been pretty hostile to women in general, but young women in particular.
I want to talk about what else you discussed at the IEC's dialogue and the role of women in leadership. In particular, if you could also touch on the security of women involved in electoral management.
So, elections, our elections were free and fair, largely without large forms of violence. What we were told at the IEC by the commissioner was that, the female commissioners felt a lot more unsafe than their male counterparts. what did happen in this elections was the IEC worked together with the women's groups to develop a women's electoral management protection mechanism. And they had observers in all of the different provinces who recorded the kinds of violence that women were experiencing. Because it's not just electoral commissioners, but it's also the public and some of the women who were observers. But that is a new initiative, and I think that is taking us in the right direction, because we don't at the moment really have the data as to how prolific or how bad violence is against women politicians. We know that it exists. Studies have been done globally, from verbal harassment to threats of death or rape. So we know that it's a form of intimidation to really stop women from participating, and it works. In some cases, women don't want to feel that their lives and their families are at risk. So it's a good strategy, but we need to find out more around the types, because it's a particular type of violence as well. And we need to, with a particular motive, and we need to start to address some of those factors. So that the political space is more enabling for women to participate in, and not a dangerous space.
No, absolutely. Susan, thank you very much indeed for that insight. We really do appreciate it. Susan Tolmay from Gender Links, Gender and Governance Associate, talking to us about a dialogue, IEC dialogue, that was held. And in particular, what has been the decline of women representation in this seventh administration, the role of women in the electoral process, and some of the challenges that are experienced there.